Well, hello and welcome. This is my colloquium presentation. I am Troy Sote, and if you're here, it means you are interested, at least in some capacity, in my senior show. And thank you for that. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be talking about my work. So with that, let's get started. So here we have the artist statement. It's a lot, obviously, and you can read it at your own pace, pause the video if you need to. But I want to highlight the bottom part here, where it says each piece either introduces a location or a space, or it revisits that same idea from another angle, as Claude Monet did with his study of the Rouen Cathedral, or Emily Dickinson with her poetry about or pertaining to her garden. And so that is sort of the heart of this. All of my pieces center around a couple different ideas and are different interpretations from piece to piece of that idea, or revisitations, I guess, for lack of a, I don't know if that's a word, but for lack of a better word, of an idea, viewing the same idea from a different angle. I also want to add that the piece kind of, the show kind of became, in a sense, sort of a timeline of my dealing with the COVID era and going from kind of grief to gratitude. So I look forward to talking about that aspect as well, which is kind of a secondary but maybe more personal element to it. So with that, let's go into kind of my inspiration first. So here we have the Rouen Cathedral series by Monet. And so I think both with Emily Dickinson and with Monet here, the thing I'm capturing, or the thing that was brought to my attention about this series in particular, is his fixation on one object and the viewing of that object through multiple settings. So about the series itself, there are something like 30 different paintings of this of the face of this cathedral, all under different lighting, and all tell kind of a dramatic and very different story. And so, as I've previously mentioned, trying not to be too repetitive, I think that's the thing that really stuck out to me, was his willingness just to sit with something and to work it over, work it through. Yeah. And I guess the same thing sort of applies here for Emily Dickinson. She, it's maybe a little bit cliche, honestly, to even have Emily Dickinson in the list. When you think of poetry, who do you think of? Emily Dickinson. But I think the thing that really resonated with me about her poetry during quarantine is that, well, I think it just had a new sense of a new life. It gave it a new life, right? And she never even left the town that she grew up in. She never left Amherst. And so all of these volumes of poetry are all inspired by the things that she's directly surrounded by, the things that are her only world, the things that are the most important to her. And she has a way of seeing details and capturing those details that kind of stuck with me throughout the pandemic, when I kind of found an old book somebody had given me back and was able to start reading through. Also, I have another book reference on here that kind of creates a broader picture. It's more biographical. It's called Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life. Also a really good book that just kind of talks about like the plant life that she had kind of in her garden, and there are some really cool illustrations in there. So that's not maybe necessarily relevant, but it's a really good read if you have the time. All right, so let's move into my work specifically. So we have Yucca brevifolia, and so we have, with this painting, we have the start of kind of the first cluster of ideas. There are probably 3 or 4 paintings kind of in this, I don't know, micro series, if I can call them that. And these all surround my trip to Southern California right before the pandemic hit. And all of the pieces are sort of reflective of that trip, and all of the pieces, in some sense, I think, have a sense of yearning to go back and to remember, to fully experience what I have experienced, because there is a sense with memory, there is a sense of kind of incompleteness, kind of fragmentedness, and I think that's kind of what I was trying to do here with this piece specifically, with the juxtaposition of kind of several different elements of the scene in Yucca Valley over top of each other. And keep track too of the dates. This one was March 20th, so this was March 2020. So that's immediately following coming back from the trip. And so by contrast, this one is actually a year later, and so Joshua Reimaged is a collage piece, and I hope the first thing that you notice is the very different style between the two, right? So in the last piece, I talked about how remembering specific fragments and specific elements of Yucca Valley. And with Joshua Reimaged, this is now March 2021. This is a year after. This is a year into the pandemic. And a lot of those specific memories, I think I can say, have sort of faded. We'll see that's not necessarily the case all the time, but a lot of those memories have sort of faded, right? And so with this one, for me, it was more about capturing the feeling specifically, looking back, and the things that I remember a year later, which would be the textures, the feelings, the sound of being in Yucca Valley. And so that's what this is. This is a collage piece. And so the base layer, let's see if I can use this properly. Right here, this is the base layer, kind of, there's newsprint collaged under everything else. And then there is stucco laid over top of it, and then there's paint, acrylic and charcoal laid over top of that as well. And I used the collage underneath and then scraped away to the newsprint. With the stucco, I knew I was going to get kind of a texture and a sense of depth, and I wanted to push that a little bit further, and so that's why the newsprint is under there. And and so I can't go back, but I tried to use some similar elements and similar colors between the two to denote the connection, but also I think this piece kind of stands out on its own. It's it marks kind of the difference that a year makes with a memory. So all right, and so this glyphic triptych, this is, I have not had any of these in the show yet. This is the first set. These are tinted cyanotype. Cyanotype just essentially is an old photographic process where you take you coat watercolor paper, in this case, and then you take a negative and put it over top, and then you expose it to UV light. And so it's a really quick and kind of dirty way of making a contact print. And so I talked about in the last piece sort of things kind of being sunken down to kind of emotion and feeling, and But I think maybe what's truer of what's happening a year later when I think about the trip is that there's actually a further dichotomy between those physical memories that I have and those emotions that I felt. And so that's why I think these three are framed individually, and also I think that speaks to why I chose sort of the floating frame, which is what these are. This is transparent, sort of the floating frame in the background. Because for me, I think it feels like it's the memory is encased, it's trapped in amber, it's stuck, it's fixed, and it's not going anywhere. It's permanent. And I think just the composition of having these kind of abstracted elements of the rocks and the formations, I think that lends to kind of the permanence of some of those memories in my mind. Even if they start to kind of erode away and become smaller, they're still there. So, okay, and so then I would call this is Hightower. I would call this sort of a transition piece. But I do think that this piece still speaks to the longing early on in the pandemic to be anywhere except in my house, right? To explore, I don't know, some sort of city, some sort of metropolitan area. And this piece is just based on a sketch that I did during that time, kind of just, yeah, piece that I did during that time. And so here we see that it's a collage piece. And so I have actually, this is cyanotype as well. However, this time instead of an actual photo negative, what I did is I took a piece of transparency paper and a dry erase marker, and I drew the elements of this building, such as the windows and kind of the top here, and I put that over top of the cyanotype and essentially did the same process. This, however, previous cyanotypes I didn't mention were tinted with tannic acid, which essentially is wine, and this is the natural color of the cyanotype after exposure. All right, so we go back to tinted cyanotypes, and I think this piece is, well, first of all, this piece was the most cathartic for me, I think. When I think about the timeline, when I think about moving from grief to gratitude, this is the piece that kind of encapsulates that for me. So I think one of the hardest losses that I had going into the pandemic was sort of a spiritual one. I'm a visual person, and part of my spiritual language is kind of like the high architecture of the cathedrals that I grew up with, and the pandemic negated all of that. It took that element of finding spirituality in those high, lofty moments. It got rid of that completely. And so when I think about little cathedrals, I'm trying to do a couple of things. These are building blocks, children's building blocks, and of course I created this environment, and then I forced the camera into this perspective, and I hope that I hope it's a little satisfying, but I also hope it's a little bit jarring, in that we know that this is an imaginary space, that this is nothing that could, it's temporal, and this is nothing that could ever last, so to speak. Yeah, so this is Little Cathedrals, and again, this is a tinted cyanotype. So here we have Stuck Between Frames, and so I think this is where I kind of transitioned into or got more inspired by the observations of like Emily Dickinson, right? This building here is just down the street from my house, and I think pre-pandemic I didn't really notice it, but into the pandemic I saw it every day, and it started off, if we go back to Hightower, it started off kind of as like this symbol of not being able to travel, if we're sticking to that, right? This symbol of being stuck. But I think over time it changed for me, and it began kind of a sense of wonder, and as I started to consider like the history of this building, and I started to create this narrative about what this is. And the composition itself, I called it Stuck Between Two Frames, simply because when I was scanning, this is based off of a photo that I took, and when I was scanning the film negative in the scanner, it got stuck, and this is the image that was produced. It was literally between two frames. And so when we talk about this building, we talk about an appreciation that I've kind of grown into. But we still have a little bit, I think, of the yearning to be elsewhere. And so I just wanted there to be kind of that contrast within this piece. But we see that kind of changes in this one. Reconsidered interior, I actually would associate with the previous piece. As I mentioned, I sort of began to create this sort of timeline or this story about the building, and assuming that the building is abandoned, like what does the interior in my mind look like? And I think this is sort of a representation of that. Again, this is a collage. I did the same sort of thing. This was blank newsprint on the bottom. I collaged on top, and then I used acrylics and then stucco over top of that. And then, of course, as I did with a previous piece, as I did with Joshua Reimagined, I kind of carved into this piece. So then we have roses. Yeah, I think this is based off of a photo that I took in on West 41st Street, actually here in Sioux Falls. There is this little quaint kind of flower shop that's tucked into sort of a strip mall. It's called Flowerama or something like that. And the only thing, I wouldn't really notice it, but the thing that sticks out to me as I'm driving home at night, every night, is this beautiful blaring kind of neon sign that says roses, right? And of course the composition here is sort of imagined, but I think the thing that kind of captivated me about that sign, that got me to just kind of stop and stare for a while, is what that sort of high key light was doing to everything that did actually exist in the space, and even to the outside of the building to some degree. And so I wanted to be able to kind of celebrate that, to kind of capture that. Yeah, so this is roses, and it's one of two. So this is rearrangement. It is a collage on wood panel. I think the thing I really want to point out here is what this area over here. Oh, let me grab the pointer. What this area to the right kind of became to me. Of course, this is cyanotype and watercolor over top, and you will see this print sort of in the next piece. And I'm quite happy that I was able to do two separate pieces with this image, um, because I think I looked at them and I handled them very differently. The geometric sort of shapes here, the geometric patterns, to me came to represent humanity's kind of lean into nature and flourishment of nature in some ways, in some healthy, sustainable ways, some not so healthy, but I digress. And kind of a celebration of that, and kind of a celebration of the way, at our best, humanity and nature are not really even that different, but still come together and work together. And again, I wanted this piece. This was in terms of the timeline. If we're still talking about that, this piece I would say falls towards the end, closer to the present, and I wanted it just to be a celebration of something I've enjoyed looking at, something I've enjoyed viewing, and again, getting to kind of create my own sort of narrative concerning the flower shop and concerning kind of what goes on in the flower shop. So this is rearrangement. So our last piece here, we have To Make a Prairie. It is a cyanotype, again with watercolor over top of it. And of course the name comes from Emily Dickinson's poem there, which you can see in the middle of the piece. And I think the poem, it's inspired by the poem, and I think the poem speaks to something of the vitality of nature, but also the kind of impermanence of nature, and the needing to redo this consistently year after year after year. The needing of to remake a prairie every year, right? And so with that, I think the piece for me speaks about impermanence, and so that can be impermanence either in terms of like the growing season, so whether it's watching like a seedling come to mature, watching a seedling become mature and seeing like the products of that, or we can talk more broadly and more seriously about like poor conservation efforts in the last 40, 50 years and beyond, and how we're coming into a crisis in terms of natural resources and in terms of deforestation, and how we have not been treating the planet as we should be. I hope this, if this piece is successful, it's because it elicits an appreciation for nature, and it brings to mind all of those things, all of those areas where we do need to get better. And with that, that concludes the show in itself. I just now would like to say thank you to the art department at the University of Sioux Falls. Cisa and Joe, thank you for all the effort you guys have put into the senior kind of capstone project. Yeah, and people who maybe are not necessarily at the university as much anymore, but who have had still significant impact on me, like Jeff and Romy. Thank you guys too for everything you've taught me over the years, and all your gracious help, and yeah, helping me get inspired. In terms of media, Nick and Nancy, thank you guys for all of the technical skills that you've taught me. Like, this is going up on my website. That's not possible without all the stuff I learned from Nancy last semester. So thanks for that. And Nick, thanks for allowing me to kind of just sit with my photography and be able to experiment and develop my photographic style. I really appreciate that. I finally want to give a huge shout out to Michelle St. Verain. You were absolutely 100% like such a help with this show, and you were such a good kind of landing spot to kind of bounce ideas off and get feedback throughout the whole process. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for putting up with my sporadic emails when those would come up. And I would also like to say thank you to you, the viewer, whoever you are. I appreciate specifically your interest in my art, but more broadly, I appreciate your interest in art as a whole and the humanities as a whole. And any day that we can come together and celebrate the humanities is a good day. So thank you for tuning in and watching, and have a wonderful day.